On the 15th of January 1962, workers in Derveni, Macedonia were widening a road when a bulldozer made a shocking discovery. A series of perfectly preserved tombs dating back to the 4th century BCE, back to the days when wild Aristotles roamed the earth. Given that these tombs were basically undisturbed, wonderful artifacts were discovered. Perhaps the most beautiful piece of Hellenic metalwork ever found, the massive 40-kilogram Derveni crater held the incinerated remains of both a man and a woman interred in one of the crypts. Inscribed on the crater, we even learn the name of one of those people inside. Indeed, it's hard to overplay just how beautiful this object is. Anyone would be lucky to spend eternity in such a sublime vessel. But the crater isn't the most important discovery to be found in the tombs of Derveni. Atop one of the crypts were the remains of the very funeral pyre which had incinerated its inhabitant, and in those ashes, as if by a miracle, were the charred remains of a papyrus roll. Totally dried by the flames, the humid Greek environment didn't destroy the manuscript as it had countless others, and the columns of texts were partially preserved. The Derveni Papyrus, as it's come to be known, is the only papyrus text to survive from ancient Greece itself, and it's the oldest manuscript ever found in Europe. Within its columns are an amazing survival of Orphic poetry and cosmology, philosophical hermeneutics of ancient science and philosophy, and were likely thought by the person cremated with it to be the key to the afterlife itself. In this episode, I want to explore the mysterious, perplexing, and miraculous text of the Derveni Papyrus. And if you're interested in ancient mystery religions, hermetic philosophy, magic, or the occult, make sure to subscribe and check out my other content on topics in esotericism. Also, if you want to support my work of providing accessible, scholarly, and free content on topics in esotericism here on YouTube, consider supporting my work on Patreon or with a one-time donation. You can find those links below, and I really appreciate your consideration of supporting this project and this channel. But now, let's turn to the charred 26 surviving columns of the Derveni Papyrus. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. I have to admit, the discovery of the Derveni Papyrus sounds a lot like the opening of a new Evil Dead movie. I mean, you have ancient sealed tombs and esoteric texts surviving being burned atop a funeral pyre, a cryptic mystery cult, and a bunch of scholars trying to unlock its secrets. There's even anonymous publications of sections of the text that were never even authorized. But this fantastic story, which isn't widely known for some reason, actually happened, and scholars are still working hard to understand just what this text means and how it fits into the religious and philosophical landscapes of the ancient Greek world, one of the most intellectually and spiritually important periods in Western history. The papyrus itself survives in 26 columns, most of which are very badly damaged, such that sometimes only single words can be read, while others actually contain numerous lines of running text. Sadly, the bottom section of the text was totally destroyed by the funeral pyre, and so only the top half of the text or so survives. Further, the process of unrolling the text using fresh papyrus juice to stabilize it and requiring as delicate a force as static electricity to carefully unroll it, even thinking about this process makes me hold my breath, also damaged the text further, and the placement of the remaining fragments is pretty perplexing and the object of a lot of scholarly debate. So even before diving into the text itself, I want to offer a kind of partial disclaimer. This text is fragmentary, even the arrangement of which is still the subject of ongoing debate among scholars. It's only recently been published in the first edition in 2006, the contents of which are themselves contested. Its contents are mysterious and deal with highly perplexing material, the mystery cult of Orpheus, and its relationship to the cosmological speculations of the ancient philosophical world of ancient Greece. And the interpretation of even the clear parts of the text is still highly contested by world-class scholars. I want to make it clear that I'm no expert on this text and that my discussion should be taken as an introduction and a preliminary one at that. This amazing text needs to have a lot more research done on it, and while I'll do my best to present what I take to be a pretty solid analysis, almost everything I'll say about the Derveni Papyrus could be contested by scholars who've produced monograph-length studies of these mysterious 26 columns of charred papyrus. So, sufficiently disclaimed, let me say a whole bunch of stuff that will likely prove to be wrong in a few years, and that scholars who are a lot smarter than me will probably disagree with. Fun. Now, if this text weren't already giving off serious Evil Dead vibes, the first recoverable words of the Derveni Papyrus should send a shiver up your spine if you know anything about Greek mythology. The first fragmentary few columns of the papyrus opens by discussing some type of funerary rites and their relationship to the terrible Erinyes, also known as the Furies. More ancient than even the Olympian gods, the Erinyes stalk the unjust with their brass-studded whips, tormenting their victims to death. All right, esoterica real talk time. If I were the scholars opening this miraculously preserved funeral pyre tomb of horrors, there's a lich nearby named Aserarak text, and the first words I could read were Erinyes, libations, daimones, destroyed utterly, and we're only on the fragments of the third column, I might suggest that we need to think more deeply about our life choices. Now, I'm also the guy that sticks around and tries to strike up a conversation when the house tells you to get out. You know, I suspect that if you're watching this channel, you're probably that person too. So let's keep going. It's not like our friends are going to possess themselves with ancient evil spirits. So let's keep reading a book that's clearly terrifying. The first 6 columns seem to be some kind of discussion of the afterlife, especially how an initiate should understand the nature of the Erinyes and the daimones in relationship to the fate of the dead in the afterlife. Specifically how the initiate is to properly understand the very process of initiation. The author seems to take issue with some type of initiation process whereby those initiated don't really understand or comprehend just what's going on, and thus the initiation itself is somehow problematic. Now, again, the first columns are highly fragmentary, and exactly how to interpret them is really contested. But a discussion of the initiation and the afterlife would suggest that this text has something to do with the ancient mystery religions of Greece, specifically that of the Orphic Mysteries, and sure enough, it is. Further, a tantalizing quote from Heraclitus also tells us that we aren't dealing with an exclusively religious text. Indeed, Heraclitus himself was critical of some of the initiatory mysteries, and so we're dealing with an early philosophical material here as well. By column 7, the text is in much better shape, and sure enough, Orpheus is described as having composed poetry in which, quote, momentous things are hidden in the verses. And these poems are nothing short of what the Derveni Papyrus calls a holy discourse. And what follows in the remaining 21 columns is positively astounding. The text is a religio-philosophical commentary on an otherwise unknown ancient Orphic hymn in which the author attempts to synthesize the most cutting-edge scientific philosophical theories of his day with the inner mysticism of the Orphic Mysteries. If esoterica explores the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion, then the Derveni Papyrus is perhaps the most outstanding text in that regard. It's the intersection of all those things. Now, Orphism, or the Orphic Mysteries, is going to get its own episode at some point in the future. But to summarize, the mysteries seem to have been introduced into Greek religious life in the 7th or 6th centuries BCE, with the poet Orpheus acting as a kind of savior figure to usher the dead into the afterlife. This was accomplished by carefully studying the hymns attributed to Orpheus as like religious scripture, being properly initiated into the mysteries themselves, making proper sacrifices, and living a life marked by some degree of purifying asceticism, including what seems to have been vegetarianism. The core of their mythology was focused on both Orpheus's descent into the underworld and similarly the death and resurrection of Dionysus. Indeed, it may have been that Orphism emerged as a kind of ascetic reform movement within the Dionysian mysteries more generally. But the exact origins of the Orphic cult and the Dionysian cult, all these mystery religions, remains very, very, very mysterious. What's also striking about Orphism is that its theogony, or history of the gods, differs in important ways from that of the traditional account of Hesiod. Further, the Orphic mysteries were somehow tied to Pythagoras and his weird mathematical cult, and its priests were known with some degree of contempt by Plato and others. Of course, Orphism would survive in various forms for centuries, well into the Christian period, and indeed, the relationship between Christian and Orphic mythology is a fascinating topic. Orphic cosmology, including its famous account of the egg, would become incredibly Baroque, and nearly 90 Orphic hymns from the late classical world survive to this day. Though those are later developments in Orphism and are further afield than the Derveni Papyrus, which, while the manuscript dates to the late 4th century, the text itself seems to go back to the end of the 5th century BCE. Again, I'll be making a whole separate episode on the incredibly complicated nature of Orphism at some point in the future, but now let's see how the Derveni Papyrus seems to interact with both the early history of the Orphic cult and the philosophical scientific developments of the 5th century BCE. As I mentioned a moment ago, starting in column 7, the author begins to reveal what they take to be the authentic core of the Orphic initiatory poetry and rites by performing a commentary on an Orphic text explaining how Orpheus hid philosophical wisdom in the riddles of his hymns. What unfolds is a distinctive Orphic theogony which is interpreted using the cosmological speculations of what we would now call the pre-Socratic philosophers, specifically the school of Anaxagoras. Let's look first at the cosmology a bit. The Derveni author seems to be at pains to interpret the Orphic theogony as not describing the birth of many gods, but to consolidate all those gods into a single deity. Further, the author seems to want to explain away apparently outrageous aspects of the traditional Hesiodic theology, especially the series of incestuous rapes performed by Zeus, and a rather shocking moment in the specifically Orphic theology. As you may know, from the traditional theogony of Hesiod, following the castration of Uranus by Kronos, the phallus is cast into the sea, giving rise to Aphrodite. It seems that the Orphic theogony actually varied here from the Hesiodic one, with Zeus actually swallowing the phallus and thus giving rise to all the other gods himself. Now, there's debate on this, and the later Orphic myths also seem to reject this idea with Zeus swallowing Phanes. Well, why think that the phallus-swallowing version is perhaps more ancient? Because it kind of is. In the Hurrian Hittite kingship of heaven myth, an earlier Indo-European theogony, upon which the Hesiodic theogony seems to be at least indirectly dependent, the cunning god Kumbari castrates the sky god Anu, and after swallowing the phallus becomes pregnant with several gods, including the weather god, the rough equivalent to Zeus. It seems possible, maybe even likely, that the original story underwent some kind of alteration either by Hesiod or perhaps prior to him, and that the Orphic myth, perhaps imported more directly from Anatolia, preserved this more arcane, and at least then, and probably now, much more shocking version of the story. Now, again, this is all heavily disputed, but it seems that the Derveni writer is trying to allegorize all of this material by harmonizing the myth with the philosophical and scientific ideas of the late 5th century BCE. Oh yeah, you may be wondering what the phallus represents in all of this. It represents the sun, just the sun. But let's turn to the philosophical ideas that are interpreted into the text. It appears that the Derveni author is commenting on this Orphic hymn so as to interpret it under the aegis of the philosophical school of Anaxagoras. As you may know, Anaxagoras held that the cosmos began as an infinite continuum of infinitely small particles, which, almost like a vast ontological fractal, contain the totality within each single individual. This vast particle field is set into motion by the divine mind, or nous, which causes the field to begin to move in vortical motion. According to Anaxagoras, as this vortex spun, the various elements emerged, forming the cosmos as we know it. Though, given his conception of a portion of everything in everything, this kind of fractal ontology of the cosmos is fundamentally of one substance and being, with difference being only an apparent effect of the vortex movement driven by the divine mind. Now, the Derveni writer is following a specific, somewhat idiosyncratic interpretation of Anaxagoras, combining especially ideas from Heraclitus and also those of Diogenes of Apollonia, hence the ontological priority of fire and air in the papyrus. And all of this taken together is what makes the text so impressive, at least to me. What we have here is an esoteric text produced in a mystery religion being read to express what was, at that time at least, cutting-edge philosophical and scientific theories, and then surviving until today after being burned with a Macedonian aristocrat, probably in anticipation of securing a beneficent afterlife. I can't believe I get to say a sentence like that, and it's true. I can't really express how much joy it brings me to know that this text is real. So, esoteric glee aside, who wrote this thing? As I mentioned earlier, the text was probably composed in Athens at the end of the 5th century BCE by someone with knowledge of both Orphic mythology and initiation and the philosophical scientific theories of the day. As you might imagine, that limits the field quite a bit, but it doesn't totally help to identify the author. The two theories I find the most compelling are those of Professor Jenko and Betegh. On Jenko's read, the text was composed by the philosopher Diagoras of Milos and is actually his lost work, Apopyrkizontes Logoi. Now, I would translate that title, but we don't have any idea what that word means. The best guess, and I'm not kidding here, is that Apopyrkizontes was some kind of wrestling move. Yeah, a wrestling move. There were several works by sophists of this time that named their books after wrestling moves, like Protagoras' book Katabalontes Logoi, or literally the knockdown arguments. It's sort of like naming your book the Atomic Elbow or Pile Driver or something like that. I mean, he should have called it not the phenomenology of the spirit, but the choke slam of the absolute. At any rate, Jenko argues that Diagoras composed the text as part of a rationalizing program where religious texts reveal truths, but only the truths of philosophy. He likens it sometimes to someone interpreting the Book of Mormon to reveal that it actually teaches Einstein's theory of relativity, which is colorful. We do know that Diagoras was, like several other people at the time, including Anaxagoras and Socrates, condemned for atheism or mocking the mysteries or generally aceibia or impiety more generally. And there was actually a dead or alive reward put out for Diagoras after he escaped into exile. So that kind of got Westworldy there for a second. This is an interesting theory, and I'll include a link to Janko's article, which also includes a preliminary translation of the papyrus as well in the description below. I also find Gabor Betegh's argument very compelling as well. He argues that the text was composed by an Orphic priest who's attempting to explain just what the Orphic mythology means so that initiates can have a proper understanding of what they're being initiated into to begin with. The author does seem to complain that those initiated don't really understand what's happening and that such initiations are inferior. So in this read, the author is teaching the inner esoteric meaning of the hymn and the Orphic mythology using developments in the Greek philosophical scientific theories of the time. This theory is also interesting because we know, for instance, from Plato, that the Orphic priest of that time did have something of a PR problem. Plato seems to have seen them as something like fire and brimstone preachers who primarily bothered the wealthy. While it seems that people thought that Orpheus did have true wisdom, Socrates mentions him as one of the people he looks forward to chatting with down in Hades, the priests and initiation had, by at least the late 4th century BCE, become the object of some skepticism by the learned elite. Hence, this read sees the Derveni author as trying to show the value of the Orphic scriptures by revealing that they contain secrets that the philosopher-scientists of that day were only just then discovering. Of course, it does this through a series of allegories, etymologies, and creative rereading that had some precedent in antiquity, but is a real genuine innovation on the part of the Derveni author. To be honest, I don't really have enough expertise to have a position on which opinion I think is closer to the truth, and you'll just have to read the arguments for yourself and read the text for yourself and see which one makes the most sense to you. That said, the Derveni Papyrus is one of the least known and yet one of the most exciting textual discoveries of the 20th century. It doesn't get the press of the Dead Sea Scrolls or the Nag Hammadi Library, but I really do agree with Janko when he said that the papyrus is, quote, the most extraordinary new text on Greek religion to emerge since the Renaissance. I'll also add that it's of special importance to the intersection of philosophy, ancient religion, and ancient esotericism as well. To be very honest, however, the literature on the papyrus is incredibly specialized. Articles and monographs on the text do require a substantial knowledge of ancient philosophy and religion, along with a pretty strong grasp of ancient Greek. These are the kinds of texts where Greek and Latin are quoted with no translation. The expectation is if you're reading this article, you just read Greek fluently. So with that warning, the first edition of the Derveni Papyrus only appeared in 2006, and then not without some controversy. It's now considered the standard text, but scholars aren't unanimous about its reconstruction. The articles of Janko are excellent, and his argument about the papyrus's author is fascinating. A relatively accessible text is Gabor Betegh's monograph, which, while specialized, does provide a reconstruction of the text and a diplomatic presentation of the arguments in the field and his own position, which is respectfully provisional. If you want a really solid introduction to the text, this would probably be the volume that I would suggest picking up. Surprisingly, it's also not that pricey. The Derveni Papyrus is a fascinating text, and I really hope it gets more public interest in the future as we continue to unlock its secrets. Make sure to subscribe, check out my other content on esotericism, and consider supporting my work via Patreon. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.